Cannabis & Pee. ¿Dónde se encuentran? Panelistas: Hilary Schroeder, Juul Labs, Estados Unidos. Cristel Gedeón, Afria Inc., Canadá. Leonardo Costa, Brum Costa Abogados, Uruguay. Moderadora: Elena Camargo, Pose Herrera Ruiz, Colombia.
Buenos días. ¿Se oye? Buenos días, gracias por acompañarnos en este panel. Yo creo que para todos es indiscutible el auge que ha tomado la industria del cannabis en nuestros países, un auge que viene impulsado por la despenalización del cultivo y comercialización del cannabis, en algunos países solo para fines medicinales, en otros países tanto para fines medicinales como para fines recreacionales. Auge que también viene impulsado por la presión del sector de la salud, que ha encontrado en el cannabis unas propiedades medicinales importantes. Por esta razón, es una industria que está en crecimiento, pero que ha enfrentado unos retos que tal vez otras industrias no tienen que enfrentar. Ha enfrentado retos desde el punto de vista marcario, donde no hay aún en todos los países unas políticas similares a las que aplican a las demás marcas, sino que son sujetas las marcas que se refieren a productos de cannabis a restricciones adicionales. Ha encontrado retos desde el punto de vista regulatorio, donde no ha sido fácil conseguir los permisos de comercialización para los productos a base de cannabis. Ha enfrentado retos desde el punto de vista del derecho del consumidor, quien es objeto de protecciones a veces especiales y adicionales a las que rigen a los demás productos, y ha enfrentado retos también desde el punto de vista de las leyes de cumplimiento, de compliance, de prevención de lavado de activos, porque normalmente el dinero que proviene de la industria del cannabis despierta todo tipo de alertas internacionales en los bancos. Es por esta razón que en el panel de hoy nos acompañan tres personas que desde sus diferentes experiencias nos van a dar sus puntos de vista sobre estos retos que enfrenta la industria. Tenemos con nosotros a Cristel Gedeón, quien es la Chief Legal Officer de Afria Inc., una empresa canadiense líder en la industria del cannabis. Nos acompaña también Hilary Schroeder, quien es la Senior Counsel de marcas de Juul Labs y que nos va a hablar también sobre la relación entre la industria del cannabis y aquella del tabaco o la ausencia de relación. Y complementa este panel Leonardo Costa, socio de Brum Costa Abogados y consultor del gobierno del BID, en temas fiscales en diversas reformas tributarias en América Latina, consultor de la Asociación de Supervisores Bancarios de las Américas. Le damos la bienvenida a nuestros panelistas. ¿Listo?
I'm going to switch to English. And so I thought it was important to give you a bit of context on the regulatory framework under which we are filing intellectual property, namely trademarks. Afria specifically, I think we have approximately maybe 500 to 700 trademarks maybe pending, Elena, in South America. And we're prosecuting them along South America as we expand the business into the region, but they're all coming from Canada. And so the regulatory framework in Canada really is governing the look and feel of a lot of these trademarks and what we can do with them and how we export them out into the world. So if we're talking about the Cannabis Act, if we could change the slide, there's a disproportionate effect. Can we change the slide? Yeah. Can we switch? Thank you.
Next, preview.
Thank you. So there's a disproportionate effect of the Cannabis Act actually on trademarks, trade dress versus other forms of IP. Things like patents, industrial designs, less affected, and we can see healthy, consistent filing, at least Canada, and to some extent, there hasn't been a significant change in the US. There's a significant emphasis by the industry actually on know-how and trade secrets, which is largely out of reach of the Cannabis Act. In Canada, recreational use as well as medical use is permissible since October 17th, 2018, actually. We just had the anniversary of the legalization of recreational use, and so now we're permitted to have edibles and drinkables in the market. The Cannabis Act is the first act as a regulated health product that really strictly governs marketing and advertising in Canada. We didn't previously see that under Food and Drugs Act, so food, drugs, cosmetics, medical devices, pharmaceutical products did not have a strict promotion and advertising regime built into the regulations. There was all policies and guidance documents and industry standards, but this is the first act that we have seen come out of Health Canada that actually intends to strictly regulate promotion and advertising. And there's three fundamental tenets. One is the protection of youth. The second is safety, patient and user safety. And the last one is the ability to track supply of cannabis in the market. And that's really a black market sort of tactic to get rid of them. Under the Cannabis Act, it's important for you to really appreciate what they're intending to capture. And effectively, if you read the definition of the word promote that I've replicated for you on the slide, effectively anything that is not on the product label could be deemed promotion. The restrictions on the scope, and I do want to read to you the very last one here. So the restrictions on the scope of what's permissible under the Cannabis Act for marketing and promotion are listed in this section, and I've reproduced it for you. But what I find interesting for lawyers in the room is 17(1)(e). And basically, we cannot represent the product by any brand element in any manner that associates the brand element with something that evokes a positive or negative emotion, using an image, a way of life that expresses glamour, recreation, excitement, vitality, risk, or daring. So you guys find me something that fits outside that category. I'm not exactly clear how we get around that. Equally not permitted. We're not allowed to use our brand elements, so our logos and our names and our designs on things associated with young persons. So I asked the question, is a t-shirt associated with a young person? Is a baseball cap associated with a young person? These are the kind of questions we struggle with. Reasonable grounds to believe it's appealing to youth or is associated with a way of life. And so the act of promotion actually extends beyond those who sell and distribute or cultivate cannabis. It can extend to any person who actually sells or distributes accessories, so that would go as far as retailers, and any person who's providing cannabis-related services and media organizations. So to some extent, it can touch upon service providers, it can touch upon marketing agencies, it can touch upon individuals who are providing services to companies like ours. What is permitted? Well, very strictly only 4 types of promotion and advertising. The first is informational promotion, and that is extremely strictly data-driven. Concentration of THC, concentration of CBD, perhaps a terpene profile that you can substantiate with data. Brand preference promotion is the one where there's the most ambiguity, because that is where you can actually promote your brand, but of course, you need to be promoting your brand in compliance with something that does not evoke a positive or negative emotion. Point of sale is permissible. So in Canada, the only way you access the product from a recreational perspective is in a licensed establishment. And so you are permitted to represent your product, show that it's available, and the price only within the context of a licensed retailer. And you can provide or put your brand elements on non-cannabis products. But again, the non-cannabis products cannot be attractive to youth or reasonably something that a young person would use. So what are the downstream effects of these promotion and advertising restrictions? Well, effectively, it means that there's widespread effect on what we can represent on our websites, on our social media and our online platforms, the imaging that we are using, the logos that we're using, company and user-created content. We actually have to monitor the engagement of users on our social platforms to ensure that we remain compliant under the Cannabis Act. Product inserts and product information, so directions for use. While we do have two streams, we have a medical stream and a recreational stream, both are governed by the same rules of marketing and advertising. We're not permitted to do sponsorships and endorsements. And so we can support community initiatives, but we can't take credit for it. And this has significant implications on our trademark, on our brand awareness, and our brand campaigns. So I represented for you at the top of that slide what our products look like from a consumer perspective. It's not an attractive product, as you can see. The little yellow that you see beside the big red tag is actually our logo. And your logo must be smaller than the THC element symbol. And if you're using a word, your type, your sort of font size has to be smaller than the huge health warning symbol that they've required of us to put on the label. So they're really trying to ensure that these products have sufficient warnings and that they're devoid of a bit of that lifestyle consumer quality experience that perhaps we saw in tobacco in the 60s and 70s. And it's a significant difference from the approach that you're seeing in the US hemp market, where there is a lot of consumer products. There's creams, they're openly purchased in drugstores. It's much more of a consumer experience in the US because they're largely hemp, and these are derived from cannabis. So what happens to our trademarks? Well, there's about 3,000 trademarks at least filed in Canada to cover consumer products. But in your trademarks, you're not allowed to represent humans, animals, fictitious, or real. And so you can see that there's a significant number of trademarks on the register that actually violate the act in and of themselves. Moreover, you can't have implicit product claims. State of mind, relax, calming, soothing. We have to be very mindful of those kinds of trademarks when we're trying to name the products because they're not permitted from a regulatory perspective. In terms of trademark struggles that we've seen around the world, what we're realizing is that most jurisdictions, the trademark boards, either are uncomfortable or unfamiliar with the cannabis regulations that are new in most jurisdictions. We're seeing morality arguments in some jurisdictions where certain brands don't want to be associated with something that is similar to cannabis, so even in the same kinds of categories, even though we've restricted them to cannabis. We are in the process of educating a significant number of trademark examiners to understand that the channels of trade are different. Most jurisdictions outside of Uruguay and Canada no longer or do not permit recreational purchase, and you can either only access it through a pharmacy or through a medicinal channel of trade, and trademark examiners are not considering that at all. And in some places, a lot of jurisdictions are unclear as to what is permissible, what isn't permissible. For example, in Argentina, a compassionate use base is neither truly medical, neither truly recreational. It's a direct-to-patient access, and trademark examiners aren't exactly sure what to allow on their registers in view of the ambiguity in the legislation around the use of cannabis. And what this has created, at least in Canada, and I think we're moving towards that in the rest of the world, and I think Hillary's going to touch on this as well, is a bit of a conundrum for cannabis companies in that we're not really pharmaceutical products, we're not really consumer products, and we're not really tobacco products. And we live in this gray space of this, what we call dark market. The Cannabis Act, you can see I've pointed as between a consumer product and a tobacco product. And it creates significant problems for us from a branding, counterfeiting issue, gray market goods issue, not just because we can't get significant brand awareness and brand goodwill, but it bites us back because we have a harder time actually enforcing. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass it over to Hillary.
Oh, okay. So actually, oh, is this on yet? Oh, thank you. So actually,
I was just in Canada 2 weeks ago for my topic, which is enforcement against cannabis products, thinking about how the Cannabis Act in Canada could work as a backstop to intellectual property claims. So if at any moment you have a thought or want to interrupt or a correction, please jump in and let's discuss it. So this moves it forward.
The green one.
Oh, can I go backwards? Cool. So cannabis and IP for a nicotine brand owner. When they asked me to present at a SIPI on the cannabis and IP panel, there was 1 second where I thought, Juul is not currently selling cannabis, so I'm not sure. And then I actually realized in my day-to-day, I spend a lot of time thinking about cannabis and specifically how to enforce Juul's intellectual property against cannabis. Much of my experience today is going to be talking about from Juul's perspective as a nicotine brand owner, but I always have to say they only let me out of the vault if I tell you all publicly that I'm making statements only on behalf of myself and not on behalf of Juul Labs, or I don't get to speak at all. So my background with cannabis and IP is Juul Labs, not necessarily everyone knows this, was originally a company called Pax Labs, which was a cannabis company. It first had a heat not burn vaporizer product that when they filed all their trademark applications, they said they were for tobacco, but everybody knew that they were actually for loose leaf marijuana. And then the product evolved into the Pax Era, which is a closed system that people can use to vape cannabis oil. And after that was introduced to the market, they thought, hey, the founders were smokers. Let's also try to do this vaporizer product in the nicotine space. That was the Juul product. They did very well. And they realized in short order it did not make sense for the same company to house both a cannabis product and a nicotine vaporizer product because the regulations were so different. They really didn't make sense to house together. And then I think, which is ironic in retrospect, there was some concern that maybe the Juul brand would be besmirched a little bit by being associated with a cannabis product. That's not what happened. So at that point, the Pax product was spun out into its own company, and Juul no longer sells any sort of cannabis products itself, but it is very aware of and respectful to cannabis companies. That is where we got our start. Okay. So why is cannabis relevant to nicotine and to Juul Labs IP? As I just explained, Juul Labs was previously Pax Labs, so I think there are still some consumers out there in the world that either remember that or they kind of understand that there's some sort of association, and even though we have not sold any cannabis products ourselves or vaporizers for cannabis products for several years, we're still remembered that way in the marketplace. So that's one of the ways that our product would be relevant in the minds of consumers. I think with what's going on in the US, Canada, and other media in the world, there's lung illness that's happening in certain countries right now, possibly, probably from vape products, although they're not sure which ones. And when the media reports on it, they're definitely lumping the cannabis and the nicotine vaporizer products together. So they're cementing that association in the consumer minds. As we'll talk about in a minute, I think it is a little bit of a gray area still where all of the cannabis classes will wind up in prosecution, but I think there's going to be substantial overlap with the nicotine classes when you do your prosecution and your clearance. And for me, I'm very thoughtful. We're seeing a lot of counterfeit Juul, CBD, THC products, and it can be complex. In California, where I live, THC, CBD is a legal product. In other places in the world, it's not. And then so you have to make thoughts about enforcing your IP based on, do we want our brand being used with a product that not only is not ours, but might be highly illegal in the country where the product is being disseminated. So, cannabis often comes up for me on a day-to-day basis. Okay? To give you guys just a little bit of a further why would consumers ever think that a Juul and Pax or cannabis and nicotine products could be related? This is a pop quiz. Please take a look and think if you know which one of these is a Juul device and which one of these is a Pax device. As a trademark attorney, I have to say that I do think that the hexagon window in the Juul device is highly distinctive, and consumers associated with Juul Labs don't ever let anyone say otherwise. But clearly it's a similar device. It's animated by similar technology, and it's not surprising that consumers can sometimes conflate the nicotine or cannabis aspects of these types of products. Okay, so I just wanted to give you guys a visual of the kind of things that I'm seeing day to day that make me think about and consider which products we need to go after the marketplace that have a THC or CBD vent. You can see from this, there's several news articles here that conflate the THC products with the nicotine products. This lovely individual, I think this is a Vice article. I tried THC Juul pods to see what the hype was about. We don't offer a THC Juul pod, so that's something we have to look into. All the products on here, you'll see there's a Juul 420 product with the mint. You'll see the weed Juul pods. It's clearly our product. So also, and I believe this will be relevant to other brand owners in the candy and the fashion space. Another thing we're seeing is on my right, the Juul wrap, which is covered in marijuana leaves. These are stickers that people are selling in the marketplace. For me, that's actually not an intellectual property violation, but we are seeing candy companies put on these stickers to be used on Juul devices. We have seen major fashion brands. So I expect in the marijuana space, you're going to start seeing those kind of things co-opted for marijuana products as well. And brand owners will want to be monitoring that and thinking about if you want your Burberry check design used on a sticker that's specifically to go onto vaping devices. So here are the enforcement arguments for me as a nicotine brand custodian against the cannabis products. As mentioned, there are clearly some arguments that in some countries the goods are related. They're both smoked. Consumers often use in the US the same verb, vaped, whether you're using a THC or a nicotine product. I won't say that it's always going to be a win, as I think the cannabis industry expands and there are more things that are arthritis creams and or maybe even the edibles. You might start to see wiggle room to say these goods would not be so associated in the minds of consumers to cause marketplace confusion. But I believe in the short term, yes, there's going to be some strong arguments that these products are related when you're enforcing. So one thing that I do want to talk about, I have had a lot of counsel suggest to me that when we enforce against cannabis products that are somehow associated themselves with Juul, that we should really go after the cannabis industry and that we should say, cannabis is a drug, it's inherently bad, we don't want our brand associated with something like that. I'm not really interested myself in making those types of arguments. One, we come from a cannabis background, so I think there's a huge potential for splashback if we go around trying to disparage the cannabis industry. Two, I personally think it's going to be a successful industry in the future, and that we don't want to point fingers today with someone we might want to be friends with in the near future. That said, even though we would likely, or under my direction, we would likely not make an argument that cannabis was inherently bad and that we don't want Juul associated with it, we do look at the regulations in the country where the products are being offered, and if, as in Canada, if the product does not appear to be in compliance with the local advertising regulations, we are comfortable saying, not only is this trademark infringement, not only are you making a little pod that fits with Juul but is actually a THC product, you're advertising it in a manner that is not in accordance with the local laws of the jurisdiction where you're distributing the product, and we don't want to be associated with that. So we don't go after cannabis itself, but we do look at parties that are not in compliance with advertising law.
I'm just going to add one thing,
Yeah.
though. Most people who are doing a copy of Juul aren't the large licensed producers.
Oh, no.
Typically, black market, gray market individuals who are producing alternate products in the market. So, I mean, they're equally threatening to establish cannabis.
Yes, so actually, Juul 420, my most favorite brand with that little pot leaf over it, that's a Canadian product, and that's one of the reasons I was in Canada 2 weeks ago, and they were just like, no, you do not understand. This is not actually a legal product here in Canada. This is a bootleg product. They took me to a vape store. They showed me exactly what Christelle showed you. Everything is in this beautiful white packaging. The brand is very small in comparison to the marijuana leaf on the packaging. So this is one where we, if something like this would escalate to a lawsuit, we would not be putting in our complaint, oh, you're associating us with THC and THC is bad. We would be saying, this is a bootleg product. Not only are you causing marketplace confusion, you're not even comporting with the laws of your own country, and we don't want our brand associated with that. Other things that we look at in infringing against cannabis products, if it's advertising that it's intended for use with Juul, it violates the warranty. We don't know what's in them. They're inhaled. We're very concerned about that. As mentioned, products also often don't just infringe our rights. They manage to take down some other third-party rights with them. So if you're already a cannabis company who's not following local advertising laws and doesn't have concerns about violating Juul's IP rights, why don't you put the Cocoa Puffs bird on your packaging, or why don't you put the Supreme logo on your packaging? So we often see our rights being violated in combination with third parties, and that gives us extra incentive to enforce against those particular THC products in the marketplace, because we want all our other brand owner friends to be happy with us. Appealing to kids, I'll show you some examples. That is my number one hot trigger issue. If they're using the Juul branding in any way that's appealing to kids for a nicotine product or for a THC product, that is an extra consideration for us of something we would go after. And then another thing to consider when we're picking the biggest targets to go after on the THC violation side is, are they selling the products online without even bothering to try to verify user age, which is a real hot button issue for us. Some of them don't have any age gating at all. Some of them harken back to the days of early porn where you just have to say, yes, I'm 18, and then you can buy whatever you want. Anything that is creating youth access to nicotine or THC products in the name of our brand, we take very seriously. One thing that has been big in the US and now in Canada is we're also considering the health aspect. Again, they don't know as much about which bootleg products are resulting in the lung illness in the United States, and I believe there are now cases in Canada as well. But we are thinking about that and how we enforce our IP to keep consumers out there the most safe. This is just an example of what I see in the marketplace. This is a CBD product that was being distributed in Italy, actually. You'll see that there is a very clear trademark claim in the sense that it says Juul on it in giant letters, and it doesn't come from us. In Europe, we also have patent claims that we assert against these kind of THC-compatible products. This is a perfect example of a product that was sold online that anyone could get, even a 14-year-old, because there was no kind of age checking. Shown with fun colors and clear packaging, illegal in Canada. So this is something, if this had been a Canada product instead of an Italy product, any potential litigation would not have just asserted our trademark and patent rights, but we also would have talked about the violation of the Cannabis Act. And then youthful advertising, So I cheated. You'll see there's that little white box there with a cartoon monster using a Juul vape. That's actually from a different product, but it is something that we see. People using cartoons or very youthful imagery to sell these THC and CBD products. And of course, that goes to the very top of my enforcement list when I see that sort of activity in the marketplace. To report to regulators or not to report to regulators, as part of our IP enforcement for the THC and cannabis products, we have been, in addition to sending threat letters or bringing legal actions, we have been reporting to the local regulatory authorities that these unauthorized products are out there. It would be really great if that was like a magic wand you could wave to make all this infringement go away. But so far, including in Canada, they're not very fast in acting. So I think the real benefit there is not, at this point, it's not that the regulators have the resources to help you out, but more that you're creating a clear record that you've been working cooperatively with the government in the relevant jurisdiction. So clearance and prosecution, this is one that's only come up for me in the last few months, where I'm starting to see so many cannabis filings in class 34, which is our core class for smokers and nicotine. And I'm starting now to think about, when I do the clearance, not just like, oh, is this mark clear? But, oh, are we making a drug reference that we may not be intending? And so, for instance, we were considering a green mark associated with Juul, and I started to, see things like this Joker's Green, which, you're like, oh, smokers articles, okay. And then at the very end, cannabis, marijuana, and hemp oils, not for medical use. That's a new thing that I haven't, been seeing until the past few years. So now I'm really pushing the marketing people. We're not just thinking about third parties, we're thinking about like potential optics and if we want to keep our branding away from THC and cannabis branding. I think we are aligned in the classes with cannabis. 510 for pharmaceutical and medical products. In some countries, things like the nicotine patch are considered more medical as opposed to class 34. Charger software and electronic accessories, that's going to be the same for nicotine vapes and marijuana vapes. We no longer file in class 11 for devices for burning herbal matter. As we understand, that's been very clarified that class 34 now is the appropriate class for vaporizer products. Smokers, accessories, and nicotine offerings, as you just saw from Joker's Green, we're seeing both cannabis and nicotine in class 34. And then, of course, online and in-person retail is applicable to everyone. So we are seeing cannabis products in overlap in these classes. Here's some examples of terms that I would ask my marketing people to stay away from at this point. I think, dank, kush, and sticky are probably, marketing's not going to come to me with a new sticky or dank brand to clear anytime soon. But some of these other terms like green and tree, I've had to politely be like, oh, I think sometimes those might be terms the kids are using for the cannabis products. Like, let's pull it back a little bit.
I had to ask what dank means 3 weeks ago.
You did?
And I said, what is dank? And they're like, it means that the cannabis is dank. That was the explanation I got.
Tautology. Similarly, my counsel in Canada recently asked me if I knew that 420 was sometimes a drug reference.
Yes, I had to learn that too.
And yeah, this is just the latest example of a green mark. I made one up because, of course, I didn't want to share with you the internal mark that we were considering, but it was similar, green summer. Okay, so there's 73 active EU filings for green in class 34. All right, any brand owner can probably coexist in this space with little problem. No one has strong green rights. But then I saw some of the words Green Joker, BC Green, standing for British Columbia, Green Gold, Monarch Green, and that's when I started to be like, oh, maybe we should be rethinking this one. That is the end of my portion.
Bueno, muchas gracias a CIPI por la invitación. Yo no vengo del mundo de IP, soy un abogado básicamente corporativo y regulatorio y trabajé en la reforma de cannabis en Uruguay en un aspecto que tiene que ver con el punto crucial de la ley uruguaya y de todas las leyes, pasa en Canadá también, que es cuál es la relación que tiene el cannabis en relación a las convenciones de Naciones Unidas de Viena del año 61 y 61 y 71, y qué es cannabis, qué es lo que se puede comercializar, qué es lo que está prohibido y cómo se da esa interrelación en un mundo absolutamente regulado y prohibido, en un mundo emergente que cada día más produce y genera derivados del cannabis. Y la primera pregunta que es, cuando uno dice cannabis siempre se imagina marihuana. Y en realidad, creo que para entender esto, lo primero que uno tiene que decir, y recién lo veíamos en las presentaciones previas, que cannabis puede ser derivados del cannabis con THC, esto es psicoactivo, no psicoactivo con CBD, o directamente industrializado con lo que sería hemp o productos directamente industrializables, cáñamo. Entonces, lo que Naciones Unidas le permite es poco. Lo que Naciones Unidas en la Convención del 61 dice es, solo se puede generar cannabis medicinal sujeto a restricciones muy grandes que ningún país la cumple. Una de ellas es que todo tiene que estar en manos del Estado. Ni Estados Unidos, ni Canadá, ni Uruguay, ni Portugal, ni Holanda, etcétera, lo cumplen. O sea que, en ese sentido, todos los países que tienen cannabis de alguna forma están fuera de la Convención. Lo que pasa es que la Convención ha tenido un gran nivel de relajación y de permisión que dice, bueno, está bien, en la medida en que existe una fuerte regulación del cannabis medicinal, no tengo problema. ¿Qué es cannabis medicinal? Básicamente lo que no sea psicoactivo, que no tenga productos de THC. En Uruguay lo definieron un 1%, lo cual es una buena regulación porque hay países que están en 0,5%. El 1% me permite jugar mucho entre ese mundo permitido, entre comillas, y el mundo más prohibido. Y cuando digo prohibido, ¿qué quiere decir? Que yo tengo dificultades de exportar a otro país. Lo que puedo exportar a otro país son productos que en definitiva no sean psicoactivos. Y esa es una restricción que casi todos los países del mundo la tienen. Dicho esto, ¿qué es lo que está pasando, diría yo, en toda América del Sur, por lo menos, y en Canadá, en cierta forma, hasta donde conozco? Es que realmente el mundo se va moviendo entre esas líneas que están bastante poco claras, pero con una tolerancia, por lo menos, de parte de la JIFE, que es quien regula e instrumenta la Convención de Viena, es en la medida en que las leyes no promuevan el cannabis psicoactivo, no estaríamos en violación. Obviamente que con ese esquema está en violación Estados Unidos, está en violación Holanda, está en violación Uruguay, está en violación Portugal, Holanda, etc. O sea, todo el mundo está violando la Convención de Viena. ¿Y por qué, si todo el mundo está violando la Convención de Viena, no pasa nada? No pasa nada porque básicamente estamos en un nuevo escenario de fuerte desregulación que va a terminar en un cambio en la Convención. ¿De qué forma? Sacando de la lista el cannabis. Pero vamos hacia eso sin duda. Cuando digo vamos hacia eso, eso nos va a traer fuertes implicancias en todo el mundo legal. Por lo pronto, en lo que es exportación e importación de productos. Por lo pronto, en lo que es regulación farmacéutica de los productos. Por lo pronto, en regulación al consumidor y también regulación financiera, que esta industria hoy por hoy tiene una fuerte restricción que son los bancos. Dicho todo esto y este escenario, porque me parece que es importante tener en cuenta esto, veamos un poquito qué es lo que se estableció en Uruguay. La ley es del 2013, teóricamente es una ley que está basada en la promoción de salud, la reducción de daños y la promoción de derechos humanos. Cuando Uruguay se defendió ante Naciones Unidas por la violación a la Convención, ese fue mi rol, básicamente, defender a Uruguay en esa defensa. La defensa era que Uruguay, si bien estaba violando el Pacto de Viena, es cierto que había otras convenciones, como eran las convenciones de derechos humanos, que hacían que Uruguay debía sí o sí proteger a los usuarios de drogas. Esa fue un poco la respuesta que dio el país, por supuesto no compartido por la JIFE, pero bueno, esa fue la respuesta. Otra de las cosas que hay en Uruguay, a diferencia de otros países, es que nosotros tenemos lo que es la institucionalidad del IRCA. El IRCA es el Instituto de Regulación y Control de Cannabis. Es quien otorga las licencias de cannabis psicoactivo, medicinal y también todas las licencias que tienen que ver con desarrollo e investigación y las licencias que tienen que ver con productos medicamentosos. Este instituto es un instituto que ha crecido muchísimo en conocimiento y en realidad es quien hoy básicamente trabaja en estas áreas y otorga estas licencias. Básicamente la estructura está dependiendo de una estructura fuerte de antidrogas, es un resabio de lo que son las políticas antidrogas en Uruguay, pero miren las tres posibilidades que otorga la ley de Uruguay. Una, por supuesto, es todo lo que tiene que ver con desarrollo científico y usos medicinales. Esto requiere autorización de las autoridades y hoy por hoy tenemos más de 16 productos que están bajo investigación. Lo cierto es que todavía esta área está muy rezagada porque el Ministerio de Salud Pública no ha logrado todavía establecer ciertos protocolos. Después tenemos todo lo que tiene que ver con cáñamo. En cáñamo hay 22 licencias otorgadas. El cáñamo es sin duda el principal promotor de inversiones en Uruguay. Cáñamo o hemp es todo lo que tenga menos del 1% de THC. Después tenemos el uso recreacional, que este es el más polémico, con tres posibilidades: autocultivadores, clubes canábicos y venta por farmacia, que este es donde está el negocio realmente y donde están todas las restricciones, las mismas que hoy Cristel decía que se aplican a Canadá, son las mismas que hay en Uruguay, con las mismas restricciones, con la única diferencia es que todo lo que tiene que ver la venta bajo farmacias es una venta sin marca, y ahora le voy a mostrar. Básicamente, para ser un cultivador de marihuana no se puede tener más de 6 plantas, con un cultivo anual de 480 gramos o 40 gramos por mes y con un registro de las personas. Para hacer clubes canábicos de 15 a 45 miembros, las asociaciones deben registrarse, etc. Déjenme decir una cosa interesante que pasó con las semillas. Como ustedes saben, las semillas de cannabis, hay dos productores fuertes. En Europa es Holanda y China es el otro fuerte, sobre todo en hemp. El gran problema es que cuando yo traigo una variedad de una semilla y la quiero implantar en Uruguay o en cualquier otro país, tiene que haber un proceso de adaptación a la humedad, a los suelos, etc. La gran pregunta es si eso es registrable o no. Si esa variedad que obviamente derivó de lo que fue el original en China y que ahora se adaptó y sé cuál es la adaptación que tiene a Uruguay, es registrable o no. Y hay lo que hay básicamente es una fuerte protección desde el punto de vista de la confidencialidad, especialmente de parte del gobierno, cuál es la variedad y cuáles han sido las adaptaciones que le hice al mercado. Y esa es una gran pelea, porque yo puedo tener 2 años de ventaja en haber conocido cuál fue la semilla que se adaptó correctamente a la humedad y al suelo de una región. Va a pasar en otros países, por ejemplo, Paraguay está sacando ahora 5 licencias de cannabis, Argentina y algunas provincias que están en lo mismo, con lo cual esa es una ventaja y un producto, desconozco porque no es mi mundo, todo esto en Uruguay se lo parezco con el amigo Banrel, si eso es registrable o no, pero sin duda es un producto que comercialmente me puede generar 1 o 2 años de ventaja. Miren cómo es la venta bajo farmacias. 40 gramos, 480 gramos por año. Los productores de marihuana son compañías que fueron licenciadas por parte del gobierno. Ya hay 2 y ahora salieron 3 licencias más. Las dos licencias que hay son empresas, una de ellas de origen canadiense y la otra es de origen americano. Los precios son regulados por el gobierno, lo cual ha sido todo un error, pero bueno, Uruguay quiso tanto estar dentro de lo que era la Convención de Viena que dijo, bueno, vamos a hacer que el gobierno regule el precio y que el gobierno sea el que otorgue las licencias para estar casi compliance con la Convención. Miren lo que son los números. Uruguay tiene 3 millones, no se asusten, o sea, son altos para Uruguay, pero autocultivadores básicamente son 7.000 personas. Ha crecido el nivel de quienes compran en farmacias a 37.000 personas. Esto da una tasa de prevalencia en drogas en Uruguay de aproximadamente el 1%, que es el histórico de prevalencia en drogas en marihuana. Lo que pasa es que este es el prevalente en drogas de gente que dice que es consumidor ocasional o habitual. No ha bajado la equivalencia del mercado ilegal, que era uno de los hipotéticos objetivos de la ley. Los clubes canábicos son 3.858. Muchas veces bajo clubes canábicos lo que hay son verdaderas empresas que abren varios clubes con 35 personas. Eso es un tema que el gobierno lo está estudiando para tratar de prohibirlo. Miren, esto era un poquito lo que yo les decía sobre la evolución de los autocultivadores. Fue brutal en los últimos años. La evolución de las membresías de los clubes también fue creciendo. La prevalencia, la evolución, es lo que yo le decía un poco recién, la prevalencia ha aumentado en Uruguay. El problema de la prevalencia es, ¿aumentó porque ahora no es prohibido o aumentó porque realmente aumentó? Y en todos los mercados ilegales hay una cosa que está clara. Generalmente, una vez que la prohibición cae, la vergüenza de decir que soy consumidor también cae. Y es mucho más fácil decir sí yo consumo a decir no consumo. Yo creo que no ha aumentado sustantivamente. Lo que también ha aumentado, lo que tampoco ha disminuido es el mercado ilegal. La distribución por farmacias. La distribución por farmacias es un sistema bastante interesante que tiene una trazabilidad absoluta desde la planta hasta el consumidor mediante registros que son obligatorios por parte del productor. Yo sé que de dónde salió la marihuana que estoy consumiendo, no, yo no consumo, pero digo el consumidor que está consumiendo, desde la planta hasta el paquete. Las campañas de medios están reguladas, la regulación es consumo responsable y no puede haber nada que tenga que ver con promoción, menores de edad, no puede haber radio, televisión, portales, social network, etc. Los adquirentes en farmacia también fue brutal lo que crecieron en los últimos años y tenemos un problema. Hay un problema de oferta de marihuana en las farmacias. Entonces, por eso el gobierno ahora está aumentando la cantidad de distribuidores. Eso tuvo que ver con temas climáticos, entre otras cosas. Los gramos que normalmente se cumplen por 15 gramos por mes en promedio. Una cosa divertida. Como son pocas las farmacias que venden, las farmacias ya tienen en WhatsApp a sus consumidores registrados. Entonces, el día que llega le mandan un WhatsApp diciendo llegó. Entonces, hay colas en las farmacias de la gente comprando marihuana. Es bastante divertido el mecanismo, ¿no? Miren cómo es el package. El package es prácticamente, no hay marca acá. Hay dos variedades de marihuana que se venden, variedad alfa 1 y variedad alfa 2. Les soy sincero, tiene que ver básicamente con, teóricamente, sabores diferentes, yo desconozco, pero con un fuerte package que trata de, digamos, de no promover ningún tipo de consumo, lo mismo que veíamos hoy en Canadá, no para embarazadas, no maneje después que fume, no menores, etcétera. Dicho sea de paso, hay controles en el tránsito por cannabis también, ¿no? No solo alcohol, se hace un control doble. Hay unos cuantos que han caído. Básicamente ahí ustedes tienen el código de barras que da la trazabilidad de la marihuana, etcétera. El otro tema, y con esto termino que yo creo que la industria del cannabis es una industria que va a seguir creciendo, que seguramente de la mano de lo que es la apertura de nuevos mercados y sobre todo del conocimiento que pueda haber en la investigación sobre las bondades del CBD, no hay duda que esto va a seguir creciendo. Una de las restricciones que tenemos hoy son el de-risking que están aplicando los bancos a la industria del cannabis. Primero, tenemos un tema que teóricamente hay inclusión financiera, pero al mismo término hay un de-banking o un de-risking. Esto es, los bancos no quieren trabajar con productos o empresas que produzcan marihuana. Al punto está de que a las propias farmacias que producen marihuana no le dan servicios financieros. Por tanto, si bien es cierto que el mundo cada vez más promueve la inclusión financiera, la realidad es que en esta industria la inclusión financiera ha ido de la mano de la desbancarización. Uruguay, en teoría, exige a los bancos que tienen que dar servicios financieros, pero el problema que tenemos acá es, dicho otra cosa más, para tener una licencia de cannabis en Uruguay hay que pasar por un fuerte escrutinio de anti-money laundering y aprobación por parte de las autoridades de origen de fondo, beneficiario final, y es lo más difícil hoy en día para obtener una licencia. Es un nivel de exigencia mayor al que existe, por ejemplo, para la industria financiera por parte del Banco Central. Un fuerte escrutinio que va hasta el último de los beneficiarios, etc. O sea que, en teoría, quien tiene una licencia en Uruguay es una persona o es una empresa cuyo origen de fondos es claro, que las personas no tienen antecedentes penales, etc. Pero, sin embargo, cuando recién empezó la venta, prácticamente todos los bancos advirtieron a Uruguay que le iban a cerrar las cuentas a los bancos locales si seguían trabajando con clientes en el área de marihuana. Y esto tiene que ver con algo que es la ley federal americana, que la ley federal americana le prohíbe a los bancos, especialmente a los bancos corresponsales, mantener relaciones de corresponsalía en negocios que tengan que ver con drogas. Patriot Act y alguna otra ley americana, que los dejo acá a los colegas para que si quieren profundizar sobre eso. Por tanto, los bancos americanos, los bancos corresponsales, directamente no procesan transferencias que vengan o que provengan o que vayan a entidades bancarias del exterior que puedan tener por origen o por destino algún negocio vinculado a el cannabis. Esto fue un tema muy controversial y sigue sin solucionarse. Hoy por hoy lo que están haciendo las empresas de cannabis es básicamente o trabajando por Europa en euros o, dicho de otra forma, buscando mecanismos para que los bancos le abran cuenta mediante la utilización de una empresa de servicios corporativos, agronómicos, legales, contables, que reciben el dinero y después pagan a la empresa de cannabis. Esto claramente demuestra de que hay una gran ambigüedad en la industria financiera y una gran hipocresía en la industria financiera, porque saben muy bien que la empresa número 2, que provee de fondo a la 1, que es la de cannabis, los fondos no los obtiene por ósmosis, los obtiene porque hay inversores en el exterior que están enviándose dinero. ¿Cuál es el futuro de este problema? Porque yo creo que esto es la principal restricción que tiene la industria canábica en el mundo. Es básicamente el cambio que puede haber en las leyes americanas en cuanto a la prohibición federal de trabajar con cannabis. Y la buena noticia que hay es que, voy a pasar un poco acá si termino, básicamente hoy tenemos una ley aprobada en la Cámara de Representantes en Estados Unidos que permite trabajar a los bancos con cáñamo y todo lo que tiene que ver con CBD y Research and Development. Quiere decir que si esta ley pasa, esperemos a ver qué pasa ahora en el Senado. El 30 de junio fue aprobada. Parecería ser que eso podría ser una buena noticia para la industria si es que el año que viene se termina de aprobar esta ley. Yo creo que ahí puse algunos números, lo que se estima, lo que es la industria del cannabis, la cantidad de productores que hay en Estados Unidos, la cantidad de estados que en Estados Unidos hoy tienen algún tipo de negocios vinculados al cannabis, nos hace pensar que hay que ser optimistas y probablemente en 1 o 2 años todas estas restricciones se dejen de lado. Simplemente para que ustedes vean, acá está la ley, se votó con 321 votos a favor y 103 en contra, muchos republicanos votándola, que es una buena noticia. Y bueno, y ahora el Senado tendrá la palabra. Lo que sí es interesante es que quienes fueron los principales promotores de esta ley fue la industria del cáñamo en los viejos estados tabacaleros americanos. En Carolina del Sur, en Carolina del Norte, en Virginia, porque hay una migración, y no me quiero meter en un tema que es de la colega Hillary, que hay una migración de la industria del tabaco a la industria del cannabis creciente, por lo menos uno es lo que ve. La prueba está es que hay industrias tabacaleras que están sacando marcas que tengan que ver con cannabis. Es un cambio interesante. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. I have a question for Christelle and for Hillary. It's not clear for me if there is really a relationship between tobacco products or nicotine products and cannabis products. I am a nicotine consumer, and I would never, ever confuse or associate one and the other. In fact, in Colombia, it has been recognized that tobacco consumers are specialized consumers who are not in such a risk of confusion. Is there really a relationship between the industries and the products that would cause, if the trademarks are similar?
I think it depends on the. Gracias. I think it depends on the product at issue. I think that someone is going to go into a small tobacco store and buy a pack of cigarettes and be like, oh, I don't know, maybe this is actually cannabis. I don't think so, but you saw from the images in the presentation that people are buying empty Juul pods in China, and they're filling them with cannabis, THC, CBD liquids, and they're for use in our device. So I think that, with vaping, there definitely is an association between these two types of products because they can be used in very similar devices. Now, do I think that consumers would get confused between a Juul pod product and a cannabis hand cream for arthritis, or even like a candy or gummy cannabis product? Maybe not, but I think at least some of the time there will be a strong argument for consumer confusion.
So I disagree.
Lively.
So I only disagree because I think it goes to the evolution of the market. When we're looking at the way markets are evolving, and if you take Canada as an example, simply because I just don't know in Uruguay what the route to market was on the retail side. It always is typically starting from a medical perspective and then evolving into a recreational avenue. And right now, we're in our 2nd year of recreational sales, and the purchase of cannabis can only be done, lawful cannabis, in very restricted licensed facilities. So if you're not buying cannabis lawfully, that's a whole different story. And I think that's where the source of confusion can be. But I think on a strict prosecution, from a strict prosecution perspective, what we are struggling with is the confusion even by the trademark examiner as to whether there could be a risk of consumer confusion of tobacco and alcohol. But the reality is these products are not evolved enough and the market is not mature enough for them to coexist at all in any aspect. So I think the Juul issue is, that's very particular to vaping, and that's because the user of the vape is motivated to use the same device in cannabis and in tobacco. But do I think there's a true point of confusion at the point of sale? When a consumer is going to purchase something, they don't have that opportunity just yet. And so I think until both of the products become mature enough so that they can coexist in the same stores, that's when we can start to have the discussion. But the channel of trade issue is so foundational right now, particularly for cannabis, particularly because all of these governments want to abolish the black market, that they're going to try to keep them in these restricted areas of purchase until there's a bit of confidence that the market is actually stable and not being infiltrated by illegal products. And if I look at what's happened in Uruguay, it doesn't look very hopeful.
But the one thing I would add to that is, for instance, when doing trademark clearance, there was recently a brand the company was interested in using, and I found an almost direct hit for a marijuana vaporizer device in class 34. And I was just like, this is a no-go. I understand your point about when, particularly in a country like Canada that is going to be very restricted and regulated, the consumer might not have much room for confusion because the channels of trade will help with that. But I think the vaporizer devices themselves, the physical devices, they are animated by the same technology. They're basically considered to be like the new way to smoke, whether it's the new way to smoke cannabis or the new way to smoke nicotine. And so I do think that there is room for confusion. And I do actually often have people in the US who are fairly savvy consumers who seem to think that Juul is still selling cannabis products.
So the one thing I'd say to you is a big struggle for cannabis is it does not have its own classes. Tobacco has its own classes, and we have been shoehorned into the tobacco classes. And some of the strategy to mitigate some of the concern on the tobacco side, and I mean, in some respects, we don't really want to follow the same avenue as tobacco. We want to stand as different products. There's a wellness angle to cannabis. There's other aspects to cannabis that I'm not sure tobacco can make as comfortably. And so you'll see class 34 will include these limitations of none explicitly excluding tobacco to sort of signal to tobacco, I'm not trying to step on your shoes, I just have no other class I'm eligible to be in. So I think if they could develop a class, or if we could manage to find a way to have something that is distinct to cannabis, plants is a bit of everything's a bit of an awkward fit. And so that's some of the prosecution struggle we're seeing.
El problema que tenemos acá es que la industria del tabaco y la industria del cannabis recreacional, desde el punto de vista regulatorio, van a prohibir cualquier tipo de publicidad, como ya ha pasado con marcas blancas, no asociación de productos. Yo creo que, y reitero, no soy especialista en marcas, por tanto voy a simplemente mirarlo desde el punto de vista regulatorio. Lo que sí me parece es que el mundo del tabaco y el cannabis recreacional es un mundo en donde la promoción del producto está absolutamente limitada y cada vez más regulada. Con el tabaco y con la marihuana pasó un camino diferente. De la libertad absoluta del tabaco llegamos a restricciones de todo tipo. Y de la prohibición absoluta del cannabis llegamos a un montón de cuestiones que se pueden hacer. Una industria regulada pero no prohibida. Lo que sí me parece que, y en Uruguay hay marcas ya registradas con el nombre cannabis. Hay una que es muy común, que es Cannabipiel, que es una crema para la piel. Todo lo que tenga que ver con el mundo de CBD, con el mundo de el cáñamo en general, en productos de aceites, bebidas edulcoradas o lo que sea, va a ser un mundo mucho más parecido en esa línea del 1% al mundo de los productos de consumo en general. Y para mí ahí va a estar la línea, donde yo marque el porcentaje del psicoactivo, desde el punto de vista regulatorio por lo menos.
So we're not really quite restricted on the psychoactive component. So, in Canada, you can have products up to 23%. California, I've seen products up to 90%. And we can just aspire to be able to make products that are of so high concentrations. So I do agree with you. It's sort of like the opposite movement of both industries. And I do think it's a question of maturity of the market. We're not mature enough as a business yet to know exactly what the consumer, the cannabis consumer, yeah, I'm not talking about the seasoned smoker, the general consumer, so you and I, you know, we are learning what we like in this product and what we don't like in this product and whether or not we wish to be users or not wish to be users, and that is creating even more opportunity for, I guess, confusion and more opportunity even for black market players to come in because it's not a sophisticated user just yet.
Thank you. Bueno, yo creo que debemos abrir un espacio para preguntas del público.
Gracias. Hola, buenos días. Luis Cudo de México. Felicidades a todos los panelistas. Soy un convencido como mexicano, y resalto lo de mexicano por la problemática que creo que todos saben que tenemos. Soy un convencido de que una de las soluciones es la legalización, por supuesto. Y escucho de sus ponencias de que la legalización gran parte voltea a ver al usuario. Se ha repetido muchas veces en México de que tenemos el problema de que Estados Unidos ha puesto a los enfermos y México a los muertos a través de los cárteles. Entonces, si vemos que la legalización está yendo por el lado de los consumidores, creo que estamos dejando a un costado el lado de la criminalidad. En el momento en que la legalización llegue a toda la región, evidentemente una parte del negocio del crimen organizado se les va a quitar. Entonces me gustaría conocer su opinión o cómo lo ven como expertos en la materia de cuál puede ser la reacción del crimen organizado en el momento de que la legalización sea total. Muchas gracias.
So, if I can address one item. I believe in Uruguay, but definitely in Canada. The regulatory framework governs everything from seed to sale, which means if you possess a license, you guys have a full tracking system. If you possess a license, down to your bringing in a special cultivar into the country, it is registered and flagged and tagged with the regulator. There is nothing that we can do. We register inventory on a monthly basis. We register sales. We track everything down to the gram. And permissible losses, permissible output is highly monitored by the regulator. So they are trying to regulate the entire supply chain, not just the user. User is a question of access. And we talk about that because from a trademarks perspective, it's our only point of contact with the ultimate buyer. It's the only thing that drives sale. To address the criminality point, at least in Canada, and I'll let you address Uruguay, our retail model and the governments have been mandated to at least have product or a variety of product that competes or undercuts the price of black market product. So that if a user, to sort of rehabilitate users to stop purchasing from the black market and to purchase from the legal channel. That has been more or less successful in that the black market, one, is not subject to the same restrictions that we are. So they can much more quickly adapt. So they have product that may have full of pesticides, and they may have product that is made through illegal means, that may be laced with other products. But because no one is monitoring them, they can more quickly adapt and develop an even cheaper product, an even more innovative product, an even more potent product that the consumer wants to buy anyways. So I'm, as a regulated person on the market, restricted in terms of product offering. I can only, let's say, now sell oils and flowers, and now we are entering edibles, while the black market can sell gummy bears, chocolate, Juul vaping pods. They can sell anything they want because no one is enforcing them. So it has to be a balance in order to you have a cartel concern, there's a black market concern on marijuana everywhere in the world. And the problem is, when you first legalize, the regulator has too much work to do, not enough focus on enforcement, and the police agencies have to be working with them to enforce. So, I mean, Hillary said it, do we report or not report? A lot of the times, you know that if you report, nothing really changes. And so until the market's a bit more stable, I can still have a product that's cheaper on the market, but you may want a THC product that's much higher, and you know that your dealer who has always supplied you product will match my price or undercut it. There's no taxes on you, and you don't need the exposure, in some respects, of going into a store and speaking with someone to buy it. You're familiar with your old process. So we struggle against that as an industry, and the regulators are trying to solve it, but they're just too busy with establishing it right now.
Yo creo que el crimen organizado, en la medida en que este mercado, que es muy regulado, muy incipiente, con grandes restricciones, con problemas de oferta, con una demanda creciente, va a seguir existiendo. Pero me parece que nosotros este año en el Parlamento, seguramente con el nuevo gobierno, se va a discutir algo de la ley esta. Y muchas de estas cuestiones van a surgir. La realidad está en que no se puede evaluar un cambio de paradigma en el mercado de las drogas con la regulación actual. Como bien decía Cristel, es muy difícil evaluar precios, calidades, restricciones. Yo sí creo que aún en un mercado desarrollado va a migrar el crimen organizado. Lo que está pasando ahora, heroína y cocaína. Entonces, si vos legalizás marihuana, probablemente los carteles de marihuana cambiarán y irán directamente a cocaína y heroína, porque esto es una reforma absolutamente incompleta. Esto es regulación de una de las drogas quizás la menos importante desde el punto de vista del daño a la salud, pero es una. Y lo que está teniendo la epidemia de heroína en Estados Unidos hoy y los avances brutales en cocaína en Europa no tiene nada que ver. Los precios son brutales.
Marixa Reategui, del Estudio Rodrigo en Perú. Primero quería felicitar al panel por tratar con tanto tino los retos y oportunidades que tiene la industria del cannabis en toda América Latina. En el Perú se ha implementado recién la regulación sobre el tema de cannabis de uso medicinal a inicios de este año. Estamos con todo el proceso de implementación de los registros sanitarios, de las licencias, de los registros de todos los temas de patentes y de marcas vinculados con el tema del cannabis. Y lo que me encantó mucho la exposición de Leonardo porque plantea retos sobre la regulación en el tema del cannabis. Hay muchos temas de prejuicios cuando uno habla del cannabis, ¿verdad? La gente, es más, cuando uno habla del cannabis, en sus primeros usos fueron medicinales, fueron usos de productos naturales y luego vino toda esta utilización a partir de como un psicoactivo, ¿verdad? Entonces, mi pregunta es para Leonardo, es decir, ¿qué errores no debemos de cometer en la implementación de la regulación de las licencias en el Perú? Yo sé que la pregunta es difícil. En el Perú lo que se ha hecho es juntar el agro con el laboratorio, es decir, tú para tener una licencia de producción o de comercialización sobre temas de cannabis, primero tienes que tener una autorización sanitaria como laboratorio para poder tener y pasar al proceso de cultivo y extracción de cannabis. Y en este proceso son muchos ministerios los que están implicados para este tema de regulación. Lo comento porque en Colombia la regulación ya está muy desarrollada hace varios años sobre el tema del agro. Entonces, lo que estamos viendo es no cometer los errores que han cometido nuestros países vecinos para que esto sea una realidad y que realmente el uso medicinal del producto del cannabis llegue a los pacientes. Son productos muy caros para importarlos y en la medida que se pueda hacer una producción local, los más beneficiados van a ser los pacientes. Y en nuestros territorios, la verdad que el cannabis crece sin necesidad de hacer laboratorios especiales, la mano de obra es barata y la verdad es que va a ser un éxito para cada uno de los países que podamos implementar con éxito la regulación del cannabis.
A ver, es muy difícil dar consejo en esto. Lo que sí me parece que lo primero que hay que tratar de hacer es no trivializar el consumo. El cannabis como psicoactivo, como cualquier... ¿Por qué empiezo con esto? Si tú no me estás hablando de psicoactivo, pero lo que pasa es que Nosotros venimos de muchos años de la guerra contra las drogas, de la prohibición de las drogas y de la moralización del consumo. Basados en, y voy a hacer un poquito de speech medio político, pero la realidad es que nosotros venimos de una prohibición originada en Nixon, donde el consumo era igual a pecado e igual a algo inmoral. Entonces, en todos nosotros, de alguna manera, nos surge el problemita de esto no es marihuana y mis hijos. Entonces, lo primero que uno tiene que hacer es tratar de realzar las bondades del medicinal y a quienes beneficia el cannabis medicinal, a gente que tiene epilepsia, a gente que tiene problemas de Parkinson, a gente que tiene problemas de ansiedad, etc. O sea, uno tiene que focalizar las bondades de este producto y tratar de no juntar en la misma reforma el recreativo. Ese es un error que cometió Uruguay y yo creo que Canadá en menor medida, porque lo manejó mejor, que muchas veces pone en cuestión las licencias medicinales por el uso recreativo. No trivializar el consumo y ser, digamos, no permisivos en ahora está legalizado. Porque eso es un error que me parece que políticamente, si uno mira los niveles de aprobación de la ley previo a la reforma y posterior a la reforma en Uruguay, teníamos un 60% en contra. Si bien seguimos con un 60% en contra, seguimos con mucha gente radicalizada diciendo acá se trivializaron los consumos. Y eso es un problema para una industria que es absolutamente lo contrario a lo que la crítica dice. Es una industria absolutamente legítima, legal y que genera mucho bienestar a mucha gente.
I think part of it also is, as an industry, you know, unlike pharma, we have been pushed to supply without necessarily all of the infrastructure and studies to legitimize its use. So when we go to speak to physicians, when we go to educate medical colleges, to say to them, this is the legitimate uses, and these are the causative outcomes if you use this product, this concentration, we are ill-equipped for that conversation. We are just now starting what needs to be done in order to equip physicians. And so we have an expression in Canada called the circle of care. And the people around the circle of care, some are still uncertain about the use of cannabis. And so I think, you know, trivializing the consumption of cannabis for wellness and for health is something that we are just starting the path to fixing that. So while the regulators wish to give access to the product, I think it's on the licensees and on the industry to build that education. And we need the help of insurance companies and medical doctors and nurses and nutritionists and palliative care to really get online, help collect the data to legitimize the use.
Lo siento mucho porque creo que había más preguntas, pero se nos acabó, me están avisando que se nos acabó el tiempo. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes por su asistencia y a nuestros panelistas por esta discusión tan sumamente interesante.